Photons are supposed to be electromagnetic radiation, yet we can't bend them with magnetism.
So again, we have a bold assertion.
You've got some nerve, you have. Look in the mirror now and then if you want bold assertions. That's all you ever give us. You don't test anything. It's ridiculous.
Okay, it's bent twice as much by gravity. Even though we can't bend it with a magnet.
I'm sure I said this 4 years ago. You keep raising this point that you can't bend light with a magnet. Well, quite obviously, you can't bend any alternating magnetic field with a magnet. Not even this simple voice coil fed with 100 Hz or kilohertz or any frequency you care to choose other than about 1 Hz, virtually DC. It's so obvious that most people can figure out straight away why you can't deflect an alternating magnetic field with a permanent magnet. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous that you think you should be able to. Here we have 100 Hz going through that. And yet the magnet isn't able to deflect it. And yet the magnet isn't able to deflect it. Why? Because it's going north-south, north-south, north-south. Now let's apply it with DC from a battery. It can deflect that, can't it? Pushes it away, pulls it towards. Attracts. The reason light can't do that is because light is doing that, then a millionth of a millionth of a second later doing that, then a millionth of a millionth of a second later doing that again. So on average it stays like that, as I just showed you, even with 100 Hz. So we presently have about a kilohertz running through that coil, and this magnet isn't able to deflect it because it's alternating. So on average it's neither north nor south.
Obviously nothing about photons that seem overtly magnetic in the sense that you can't bend them with a magnet.
If this coil represents a photon, then it's no wonder a permanent magnet cannot deflect it, because one moment it's north, next moment it's south. So on average it's neither, so it can't deflect it. If light is magnetic, electromagnetic, why can't you bend it with a magnet? Well, because you can't bend any alternating magnetic field with a magnet unless your magnet just happens to be alternating at the exact same frequency. If you could freeze frame light and take a close look at the millions of tiny little magnets that it effectively forms, represented by these teeth of this comb, then you can understand how an exact copy of it, same frequency, will cause a nice, neat interference pattern. They're like little alternating magnets, north-south, north-south. Then here's you massive magnet. Bend! Why won't light bend? If it's an inch big, it's 50,000 times bigger than these little magnets that light makes. These are north-south, north-south, and you're trying to deflect it with a magnet that's just north. It's not going to work, is it? The higher the frequency we go, the more pronounced this effect. 2000 Hz. Let's see how much we can deflect it at 2000 Hz. It cannot deflect it, can it? The magnet cannot deflect it. Now imagine if that was the frequency of visible light. Several hundred million Hertz. Millions of oscillations per second. Beyond our imagination, really. So now you can see that they do deflect when they're matched frequencies. Change polarities. And this is just analogous of splitting a laser beam in two with a double slit experiment. So each beam has the same frequency, so they then can interact, they can interfere with each other. They're in phase with one another. If they're different frequencies, they're not going to be in phase with one another. They aren't going to do any useful interference. Now this is just a short-circuited coil representing a surface, and that now represents a photon at a frequency. That's passing that surface and it's inducing current in that.
There's nothing about them that's overtly electric besides the fact that they move electrons. So of course they have some connection to electricity.
It's going to therefore deflect away from it because of Lenz's law. Look, let's be honest. Human beings trying to fathom out what light really is a bit like a cat trying to figure out how the central heating works, because it knows where the hot water pipes are, but that's about as far as its real knowledge goes. The cat has very limited knowledge of central heating, but it knows where the hot water pipes are. And we're pretty similar with light. We're just animals too, trying to figure out something that's beyond our comprehension, really. So don't get on your high horse, Gary. It's just embarrassing. See, I don't think any of us can afford to be on our high horse about it, whether you're a scientist or just Gary or me or anyone else. We're all just animals trying to figure out something that's well beyond our real comprehension. We have very limited knowledge of what we're talking about. And that probably explains why 100 years ago a lot of scientists still thought that there were Martians making canals on the moon. Mars, not the moon. I was tired. They really did. Actually, not even 100 years ago, I think. I'm not sure whether it was in the 1930s or 40s when scientists started having doubts about this theory that there were canals on Mars. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. Now this is just a short-circuited coil representing a surface, and that now represents a photon at a frequency. That's passing that surface and it's inducing current in that.
There's nothing about them that's overtly electric besides the fact that they move electrons. So of course they have some connection to electricity.
It's going to therefore deflect away from it because of Lenz's law. The Lenz's law breaking effect. 250 Hertz, 500 Hertz, a kilohertz. See, what's happening is that photon, as we imagine it to be, is inducing current in that surface as we imagine it to be. And therefore Lenz's law is causing it to deflect. That isn't electrically connected to anything, it's just a short-circuited coil, analogous to the eddy currents that we induce in surfaces when photons pass. Look, about me using the word induction here in the context of photons inducing current in antennae or surfaces, look, nobody has any objection to talking about current flowing up and down in antennae or in these bars of this polarizing filter designed for 10 gigahertz microwave use, thereabouts. Nobody ever has any objection to talking about current being made to flow up and down by the photons interacting with these, although when I think about it, they do tend to prefer to say that the electrons are excited by that's always seemed a strange way to explain electricity being induced in an antenna. Interacting with these, effectively lots of antennae parallel to one another at a set distance apart. Nobody seems to have any objection at all to talking about current being made to flow up and down in those. But they do seem to avoid saying that the photons induce the current to flow up and down in that. And I don't know why. I can only guess that the reason is because if you say that photons induce the current to flow in these conductors, or dielectrics come to that as well, then surely you are obliged to invoke Lenz's law of induction. Because Lenz's law of induction says that the current that was induced in those bars by the photon will oppose whatever caused that current to flow in the first place. And what was it? A photon with a magnetic aspect. So in those simple terms, it makes perfect sense that when the magnetic oscillations are sideways, it's able to induce current in the bars at 90 degrees to it. If the magnetic vector is oscillating that way, it can't do it. You're trying to induce current across the width of the bars instead of along the length of them. That doesn't really work, does it? I know I'm looking at this in very simplistic electrician's terms, but it makes more sense to me than talking a load of old garbage about saying the electrons absorb the photon and re-emit it. What kind of baby talk is that? I feel like I'm John Cleese now in the Dead Parrot sketch. Pining for the fields? What sort of talk is that? Absorbing the photon? What sort of talk is that? But it amounts to the same thing as saying that the photon induces current to flow in it and Lenz's law is invoked. Therefore, the current induced opposes the motion of that which induced it, or opposes the change of that which induced it. That's Lenz's law, isn't it, in a nutshell? So if a photon is approaching, it's going to be deflected away. If the photon is passing it, it's going to be pulled back. No wonder you get diffraction, if that's the case. Yeah, I mean, without being silly about it, why is that not a rational explanation? Is that too simple? Do we have to go down some other weird route of saying, well, and comes to that though, at what frequency does Lenz's law stop applying? Anybody wants to object to that? I would be interested to know at what frequency they reckon Lenz's law stops applying. Because if we slow down the frequency, at what frequency does Lenz's law start applying again? You know what I mean? Because if radio signals aren't invoking Lenz's law, at what frequency when we go down and down and down and down and down? Eventually getting to 3 hertz, because apparently, technically speaking, 3 hertz, apparently, don't blame me, blame Wikipedia, apparently 3 hertz counts as a radio signal. Does it now? Okay, well, who am I to argue with Wikipedia? Well, if 3 hertz counts as a radio signal, then radio signals definitely do invoke Lenz's law. Because if this was a magnet, I'm invoking Lenz's law now. Because I could feel, if that was a magnet, I could feel the induction. I could feel the Lenz's law breaking effect. So we know that Lenz's law is being invoked and that it is electromagnetic induction at those low frequencies that apparently count as radio. Sorry, I'm getting sidetracked a bit now, sorry. But it's an interesting thing to think about, isn't it? I have no idea why we have to make things more complicated than they really are. The hot water pipes are here. The current we induce in the coil has its own magnetism, which always opposes that which induced it, which is the very reason that this deflects away, like this. That's Lenz's law. That's Lenz's law. That's Lenz's law. But this is why you can't deflect light with a magnet, because it's not at the right frequency. You must be mentally retarded. Never mind the next Isaac Newton waiting for your statue or your Nobel Prize.